Before we begin, I want to share a little context for this episode. You see, this isn't a conversation about how to lead better or how to fix yourself or how to optimize your performance. It's a conversation about why leadership feels the way it does, even when you're good at it, even when things are working, even when nothing is technically wrong. If you're a person who's respected, capable, and trusted, and you've quietly noticed that leadership can feel a little heavier than it should, or maybe that it takes more out of you than you'd like, then this episode's for you. We're going to talk about leadership through a biological lens, not in a clinical or academic way, but in a way that helps you recognize what's been shaping your energy, your presence, and your internal experience over time. We'll explore how leadership lives in the nervous system, why rest doesn't always restore, and why awareness alone doesn't automatically change how leadership feels in your body. There's nothing you need to take notes on, and nothing you need to do differently as you listen. This is simply an invitation to notice what resonates and to let yourself hear language for experiences that, well, you may have sensed for quite a long time, but maybe you've never quite had the words for it. So let's get started, shall we? Welcome to Project Joyful, the podcast for health-centered leaders. Project Joyful is a space for conversations at the intersection of leadership, health, and lived experience. Here we explore what it means to lead in ways that honor your body, protect long-term capacity, and support a life that feels as good on the inside as it looks on the outside. This episode is part of the Biology of Leadership series. In this series, we explore leadership through your body, not as a performance to optimize or a mindset to fix, but as a biological experience shaped over time. Leadership doesn't just live in decisions, strategies, or roles. It lives in your nervous system and how responsibility is held and how reliability and care quietly organize your body long before you're consciously aware of it. These conversations are for leaders who are capable, trusted, and effective, and who are curious about how leadership is experienced internally, not just how it performs externally. There's nothing you need to do as you listen, no insight you need to apply. This is simply an invitation to understand what's been shaping your experience of leadership beneath the surface and what's become possible when biology becomes part of the conversation. Let's begin, shall we? If you're listening to this, then there's a good chance that leadership is working for you. You're respected, you're trusted, you're capable, you know how to hold responsibility, how to make decisions, and how to lead well. And still, there can be a quiet sense that it asks more of you internally than feels necessary sometimes. And it's not visibly, it's not dramatically, but in ways that accumulate over time. For some of you, that may have been especially noticeable as you finished last year. A feeling of being worn down, not in crisis, just spent, like there wasn't much left in the tank to give, even though nothing had technically gone wrong. And it can show up as leadership taking more from you than you'd like, or as that subtle missing out on things that actually make life feel great. Evenings that are technically free, but mentally occupied. Weekends where the body slows down, but the mind doesn't. Moments of pleasure, creativity, or ease being postponed. Not because you don't value them, but because the tasks of leadership have been given priority and leadership still feels switched on. Now, I want to be clear about what this conversation is and what it isn't. This isn't about fixing leadership. It's not about changing who you are or softening your edge. It's about refinement. Many of the women I work with aren't struggling. They're not burnt out. They're succeeding. And they simply want leadership to draw less from them internally so that there's more capacity for the parts of life that actually restore them. What we often call a leadership style isn't actually a strategy or a personality trait. It's a nervous system pattern. It's the way your body's learned to meet responsibility, to meet pressure and expectation over time. And when leadership involves sustained decision-making, anticipation and responsibility, your nervous system adapts. How cool is that, eh? It learns how to hold things together efficiently. And the issue isn't that this pattern doesn't work. It's that over time, it can quietly demand more than it needs to. And that demand begins to crowd out other parts of life. So over this series, we're looking at leadership through a biological lens, not to label or to diagnose, but to understand why leadership can feel heavier than it should, even when it's effective. And what shifts when your biology is no longer being overridden. As you listen today, there's nothing you need to change. Just notice where leadership feels smooth and where it quietly draws from your energy or your presence. That noticing, that's where everything begins. Leadership's so often treated as a matter of personality or strategy. You're decisive or collaborative, you're visionary or operational, or it's framed as a skill to be developed, something to refine, another course to go on. And all of that's got its place, right? But it still doesn't tell the whole story, because underneath every leadership behavior, every skill or strategy, there's something more fundamental at work. Your biology. Your nervous system doesn't respond to frameworks or job titles or how capable you are. It responds to load, to pace, to how much responsibility you carry and for how long. And I just want to pause here for a moment. Just take a breath. Because what I'm talking about isn't a failure of your body. It's actually the opposite. Your body is so good at learning how to support you. Like, just take a moment and thank your body for that, right? When leadership asks you to make decisions, hold standards, anticipate outcomes, manage people, and stay available, your nervous system adapts. It becomes more efficient, more precise, more attuned. It learns patterns that help you to meet demand with less conscious effort. Amazing. Do the same thing or think the same way enough times and it becomes a habit. And habits exist for a reason. They save energy by becoming automatic. And this is how your body helps you to lead, because by reducing the need to consciously work everything out moment by moment, over time, those adaptations become familiar. They start running in the background and eventually they feel like who you are as a leader. And this is where many capable leaders misunderstand what's happening. They assume this is just what leadership requires, or this is the level of presence that my role demands. This is simply how I operate. So they try to make changes at the level that they've been taught to work with, right? They delegate more. They create space in their calendar. They give themselves permission to rest. But if the nervous system is still organized around holding everything together, something subtle happens. You delegate the task, but part of you stays with it. You keep track of it. You wonder if it's being done properly. You notice yourself checking in, thinking about it, or quietly reworking pieces in your head. And on the surface, leadership looks lighter, but internally, your system's still engaged. And this doesn't just affect you. Teams are so sensitive. They can feel when responsibility hasn't truly been released. They hesitate. They seek reassurance. They wait rather than fully stepping into ownership. Meanwhile, leadership continues to take more from you than it appears to from the outside. And when I talk about leadership being expensive internally, this is what I mean, right? It's not exhaustion, it's not a breakdown, but it's the steady use of energy to carry things mentally, even after they've been delegated, or stay alert when actually nothing urgent is happening, or to manage yourself internally rather than having that energy available for creativity, for presence, or just for enjoyment. Now, none of this is wrong, and it's not something that you need to fix or improve. It's simply a pattern that your nervous system has learned really well because it's been useful. What matters is becoming aware of it. Because once you can see the pattern, you start to notice how leadership is actually being held in your body, not just how it looks on paper. And that awareness is where refinement becomes possible. Now, you may already be noticing small, familiar moments where this pattern shows up. Not as a problem, but just as part of how leadership lives in your day-to-day life. And often it's not the big things, right? It's the ordinary moments that flow from one context into the next. You finish a meeting. Decisions are made. Actions are assigned. On paper, everything's complete. And then later, you're cooking dinner or you're driving home or you're heading out for a walk, and part of your attention is still there. You replay the conversation. You think about how it might have landed, how it could have landed, what could have been done differently. You notice yourself tracking whether something will need to be clarified or followed up. Or how about this one? You've delegated something important and you trust the person, right? They're capable. And yet some part of you stays lightly connected, not because you don't believe in them, but because your system has learned to stay engaged until things feel fully settled. It keeps an eye on how situations unfold. It anticipates what might be needed next. It stays a step ahead so nothing drops. So even when the task is no longer yours, some of the responsibility is still being carried internally. You notice it as a background awareness, a quiet readiness, a sense of holding things together even when nothing is actively required of you. And that same quality shows up everywhere. You're at home and your partner asks you a simple question, something ordinary about dinner or the weekend. You answer automatically, efficiently, and then you realize a moment later that you didn't fully hear what they were asking. Not because you're distracted or uncaring, but because part of your attention was already occupied, still tracking, still holding. What about this? You finally have time. Nothing urgent's happening. And yet settling doesn't come easily. Your body slows down, but your attention stays slightly forward, available, on standby, not anxious, just alert. And it helps here to distinguish between two very different kinds of thinking, right? Like intentional mental rehearsal is a strength. You choose it, you prepare, you focus, and when you're done, you step out of it. What I'm describing is different. It's when conversations, dynamics, or outcomes are being carried internally without a conscious decision. When leadership's still running in the background of your awareness, that background loop, even when nothing's been asked of you in that moment. You haven't chosen to stay engaged, but your system hasn't fully stood down either. And this is where the impact shows up as well, because when leadership's being carried this way internally, it quietly limits what else can fully arrive. Not in obvious ways, but in subtle ones. You sit down with a book, you realize you've read the same page 3 times. You have a free evening, but scrolling feels easier than doing something nourishing. An idea flashes, something creative or playful, and it passes by because there isn't quite the space to follow it. Ease starts to feel like something you're allowed once everything else is settled. Except that your nervous system isn't actually organized to experience things as finished. It's organized to stay alert, to keep scanning, to be ready. So there's always another loose end. There's always another thing to anticipate, another moment to stay slightly switched on. And without meaning to, ease becomes something that's always just out of reach. And this isn't about judging any of this or trying to change it. It's about seeing how leadership is currently being held across your whole life, not just during your working hours. Because once you can see that pattern clearly, something shifts. You're no longer asking how to lead better. You're beginning to understand how leadership is living in your system. And from that understanding, a different kind of refinement becomes possible. So let's talk about what's happening in your body when you're at work. Not to analyze yourself and not to turn this into neuroscience for the sake of it, but to make sense of why your system keeps doing this even when you're aware of it. So at a very basic level, your nervous system is organized around one thing: keeping you safe. And when I say safe, I don't mean danger in the obvious sense. I mean continuity in this sense, predictability, the sense that things are under control enough for life to keep moving forward. And your mind plays a key role here. Its job is to decide what matters, and what it decides matters most is safety. The challenge is that the mind has a very narrow definition of safety. It equates what's familiar with what's safe. What's known needs to feel predictable, because what's predictable feels manageable. Anything unfamiliar gets flagged not as a problem, but as something to pay attention to. And this is where leadership becomes really complex, right? Because leadership's relational. It involves people, and people are inherently unpredictable. You don't know how your feedback will land. You don't know how someone will respond emotionally. You don't know how a decision will ripple through a team or a system over time. So leadership always contains the unfamiliar. From the mind's perspective, that unfamiliarity sounds like stay alert, keep an eye on this, don't relax yet. Not because something's wrong, but because the system is trying to ensure continuity. And this is where the dialogue between the mind and the nervous system comes in. So the mind notices responsibility and it says, this matters. The nervous system responds with, okay, got it, I'll keep you ready. And the mind says, good, that worked. And the nervous system learns, okay then, this is what we do. And that loop runs quietly over and over and over again. And the more often it runs, the more efficient it becomes. And this is what neuroscience is telling us. Every time a particular thought, response, or internal pattern is used, the synaptic connections involved strengthen. The neurotag becomes clearer. The pathway becomes easier to access. And over time, your brain naturally defaults to the strongest, most well-worn pathways first. Not because they're always the best option, but because they're the most efficient. And the brain's designed to conserve energy wherever it can because it needs a lot of energy. So if stay alert, stay involved, stay ahead has been reinforced through years of leadership, responsibility, and success, then that becomes your system's preferred route. Not because you chose it, but because it worked. And this is why leadership really feels finished. There's no clear all done signal. There's always another conversation, another decision, another variable. And so the mind keeps saying, this still matters. And the nervous system keeps replying, I'm on it. This isn't stress in the dramatic sense. It's organization. It's a system prioritizing reliability, responsiveness, and continuity. And the challenge isn't that this pattern exists. The challenge is that once it becomes the default, there's very little contrast. When alertness is normal, calm can feel unfamiliar. When scanning is constant, stillness can feel uneasy. When readiness is always on, the body doesn't easily register that it's safe to soften. That's why rest doesn't automatically restore. That's why time off doesn't always land. And that's why leadership can continue to draw from you internally, even when the external demand looks reasonable. So what I'm pointing to here isn't something to turn off or to override. This system served you well. It helped you lead, hold responsibility, and stay effective. What matters is understanding how it's been shaped and why it keeps running the way it does. Because once you can see this loop exists to keep you safe, and it's been reinforced through repetition and success, a different question becomes possible. It's not how do I stop this, but What would my system need to learn biologically for leadership to feel safe without staying switched on all the time? And that's where refinement begins, right? Once you understand this loop, it becomes easier to see why it doesn't unwind on its own, even when you're aware of it, even when you're resting, even when you're doing all the right things. Because leaders often reinforce this pattern without realizing they are. Not because they're controlling or incapable of resting, but because they're conscientious, responsible, and used to being reliable. So rest still contains monitoring. You're technically off, but part of you is checking. Tracking messages, thinking ahead, running through what's coming next. Time away becomes time to mentally catch up. Delegation happens, but the system stays lightly engaged just in case. Stillness appears, and the mind fills it because empty space feels unfamiliar and therefore unsafe. From the nervous system's point of view, the message stays consistent. The mind keeps saying, "This still matters," and the nervous system replies, "Understood, I'll stay ready." So even when the external demand drops, the internal pattern doesn't. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because the system's still receiving the same safety cues. And this is where rest matters, and also where it gets misunderstood. Because here's the thing, right? Rest is biologically essential. It restores resources, it reduces cumulative load, and it gives the nervous system the capacity to learn something new. So without rest, there's no space for recalibration to happen at all. But rest on its own doesn't automatically change what the system believes is safe. Because safety isn't learned through absence, it's learned through experience. So if rest is paired with monitoring, scanning, or making yourself relax, the nervous system doesn't receive new information. It just learns how to stay alert in a quieter environment. And here's something that really makes the difference. Because recalibration doesn't start with effort. It doesn't start with forcing ease. It doesn't start with overriding the system or telling yourself to calm down. And this isn't a mindset shift or a reframing exercise. You can't think your way out of a biological pattern that was built through repetition and experience. Biological recalibration begins when the nervous system starts to experience in real time that leadership can still function without constant internal holding. That responsibility doesn't disappear when you soften. That nothing collapses when you're not tracking everything. That presence doesn't equal risk. And that's not something you decide intellectually. It's something the system learns gradually through lived moments where unfamiliar states like pause, ease, or not knowing are no longer immediately flagged as unsafe. And that's why this work isn't about techniques or strategies. It's about changing the conversation between your mind and your body. So instead of the system constantly hearing, "Stay alert," it slowly begins to learn, "It's okay to settle here." Instead of "Keep holding this," it learns, "This can be shared." Over time, those experiences begin to form new pathways, not instead of your leadership, but underneath it. Leadership still works. Responsibility is still held, but it's no longer requiring that same level of internal vigilance. That's what refinement looks like at a biological level. Not doing less, not caring less, but leading with a system that knows when it can stand down. So as we come to the end of this conversation, there's nothing you need to take away or apply, nothing to fix, to optimize, or to implement. If anything, this is an invitation to let what you've heard settle in your body rather than your mind. The way leadership has been living in you makes sense. It was learned over time. It was adaptive. And it supported you to hold responsibility, to hold people and outcomes in ways that matter. Nothing we've talked about today is a problem to solve. It's simply information. Information about what has been shaping the experience of leadership, not just the results. Now, you may start to notice small moments after this, not to change them, but just to recognize them. Moments where leadership stays with you a little longer than necessary. Moments where rest doesn't quite land. Moments where ease feels close but not fully accessible. And that noticing isn't the work. It's just the beginning of a different relationship with how leadership lives in your system. So if this conversation resonates and you find yourself curious to explore it further, I'm hosting a free 3-day experience called The Biology of Leadership. It's a space to keep unpacking what we've touched on here, how leadership creates a physiological environment, why rest doesn't always restore, and what actually supports your body that carries that responsibility over time. There's nothing you need to prepare and nothing you need to work on. You simply get to show up and listen, the same way you have here. If you're curious, you can find all the details and register at tracytutty.co.nz/leadership biology. For now, let this be enough. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation when the timing feels right for you. Sending you lots of love. Bye for now. Hey, thanks for listening to today's podcast. Can I ask you a favour? If our conversation spoke to you today, could you please take a moment to leave a 5-star review? Your review will help people discover this podcast, and together we can create a world where there's even more love and more laughter. And if you want to hear more from the Project Joyful podcast, just click the subscribe button. Bye for now.